Can I introduce you to Gail Crocker of Blue Spark Magnetos? Great, Gail, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm Gail Crocker and I own Blue Spark Magnetos. After 25 years of working for the Education Department, I decided to retire. After 3 months of retirement, I decided I needed to work. I didn't want to go back to teaching. I wanted to find a job where I could use my hands, use my brain, and somehow contact with my husband who restores old motorbikes. So I bought a coil winding machine and I started my own small business, and that was 15 years ago. When Albert and a friend convinced me that it would be a really sensible career move to start rewinding magnetos, I didn't know a thing about them. So I packed up and went to Queensland to a fellow called Ivan Brown, who taught me how to wind a coil and how to service a generator. And after that, I came back to Melbourne and I chased up all of my friends who had motorbikes and I begged for them to lend me their magnetos. And so for the next 6 months, I rebuilt everybody's magneto for free, whether it needed it or not. And I have to say, about half the time they were successful. The other half, we just did them again and again until we got it right. Magneto rebuilding for me was meant to be a part-time hobby. It was to keep my mind active and my fingers nimble. I must say that it has turned out to be full-time, and I'm very, very pleased for that. I find it a very enjoyable and thrilling job. My workshop with the resident cat is tucked into the corner of my husband's small factory. So what services do I offer? Well, I will test, service, remagnetise, rebuild your magneto or your generator for your bike, your car, your stationary motor, but I will not rebuild them for planes. I'm not qualified to do that. Every rebuild comes with a 12-month warranty, which is quite flexible because I realise that often you'll have a magneto rebuilt long before you're actually ready to use it in your new car. So what will I do? I'll test and quote for you if you just want to find out what a job's going to cost or what's actually wrong with your magneto. I will strip and rewind the coil only if you feel that you're competent to build your own armature and rebuild your own magneto. Or one of the services that I get asked for quite often is to just rebuild the armature. And then you can rebuild the magneto yourself. Or I offer the complete service where I'll wind your coil, rebuild your armature, rebuild the magneto, test it on my test bench, remagnetise it, and then send it back to you so that you shouldn't need to look at it again for another 50 years. Or sometimes I'll have somebody who simply wants their magneto remagnetised, and at any time you're welcome to come out, have a cup of coffee, tour of the workshop while I do that job for you for free. Blue Spark Magnetos has a range of spare parts for a whole variety of different magnetos. We've got capacitors and condensers, bearings, insulation, slip rings by the boxful, points parts, pickups, springs, carbons, high tension leads, acetal, Bakelite parts, and 100 other bits. These are all sorted and stored in colour-coded drawers in my workshop to make it easy to find stuff, and this makes sure that when your magneto comes back to you, it's like brand new. When possible, I buy new parts from Europe, or I buy good reproduction parts from Europe. I tend to avoid the cheaper parts that you can buy on eBay because you get what you pay for. And for me, it is cheaper in the long run to buy a good part to put in your magneto than a cheap part and then have to rebuild it again 12 months later. I also buy complete stock from magneto repairers who have gone out of business, and that often provides me with parts that are now very hard to get. I have 5 full compactor rows full of old magnetos, either complete magnetos or partial magnetos, and they are invaluable for when I rebuild a magneto that I can't get parts for, whether it's something as large as the housing or whether it's something as small as just the little oiler cap on the top. It means that I can restore your magneto to its original condition. And finally, with the help of my husband, we remake parts that are broken or damaged for your magnetos. So, for example, the one that I'm holding up here is the Dixie base, which was made originally of a muck metal that just falls apart. We actually remake them, re-put them on the bottom of your magneto, and that then means that a magneto that otherwise would have gone into the rubbish is then usable again. Although you know, magnetos come in a range of sizes and shapes, most of them consist of the same major components. You have an armature, and on your armature is a primary winding of quite thick wire, maybe about 200 turns, and then attached to the primary winding is your secondary winding, which could be anywhere between 8,000 and 12,000 turns of wire that is as thick as a single hair on your head. Now, in perspective, about 10,000 windings is equivalent to about 1 mile of wire. That wire can't be crossed over, it can't be crossed over, it can't be broken, and it has to be insulated between each layer. In your magneto, you also have a simple electronic control unit, which consists of a set of points or a capacitor and is controlled by a cam of some sort. You'll then have in a car a distributor, or in a motorbike a slip ring and high tension leads. And all of this is housed in some sort of housing that either has 1 or 2 magnets over the top, or it will have a rotating magnet inside. But they're your basic components of any sort of magneto. The most important part of a magneto rebuild is the winding of the coil. And rewinding a coil is not rocket science, but you probably do need an expert to do it. And the reason you need an expert to do it is simply because of the different wires that you need and the equipment that you need to do it properly. And mostly, to rewind a coil, you need an awful lot of patience and an awful lot of practice. It's important that when we rewind a coil that we use a similar gauge wire, the right number of turns, and insulate each row with the proper type of insulation. I've brought examples of all of the insulations and wires with me today if anyone's interested in looking at them. This is a typical H pattern, which is what most of your rotating magnetos has in the middle of it. And when we wind one of these, we put about 5 rows of primary wind on it, and then anywhere up to about 40 or 45 rows of secondary wire. Each layer in between has to be insulated properly so that no layer touches another layer, and that's where the patience comes in. There are a couple of fallacies about coils. Often I'm told, oh, this magneto is for a race bike, so I need you to put more winds on it. That's a bit of a fallacy in actual fact, because there's no truth in the claim that the more winds, the better the magneto. In actual fact, overwinding a coil can give you more problems than it solves. There are formulas for working out the optimum range, but the optimum balance between your primary wind and your secondary wind. For example, we'll come back to this one again. For a Lucas Magdyno, the formula is about, for each primary wind, you should be looking at about 60 secondary winds. So if you're doing 200 primary winds, which is what would go on this, then you're looking at about 1,200 secondary winds, 12,000 secondary winds. So a little bit of history about magnetos. As most of you already know, we have another picture. Right, that picture there just shows you some of the wires that we use, some of the insulating materials that we use, and some of the different sorts of coils that we produce. Right down in the front of the picture, the bottom left-hand section is actually a secondary winding that's been insulated and varnished and just taken off a coil, just so that you can see what it looks like. And I actually have that here if anyone wants to look at it and play with it and see what goes into your coil. Right, so in 1831, Faraday discovered that a moving magnetic field induces a voltage in a conductor. Likewise, a wire coil moving through a magnetic field will produce the same effect, voltage. The first person to develop the idea of a high-tension magneto was a fellow called André Boudeville, and I've probably said that wrong, but he omitted the condenser, and so his wasn't particularly successful. But Frederick Sims and Robert Bosch first developed the first practical high-tension magneto, and it was first used in a car in about 1899. There are several different magneto designs, but the two most common ones are the shuttle magneto and the inductor magneto. The shuttle magneto is where you have a coil of wire which rotates past a stationary magnet. The second, your inductor magneto, is where your coil of wire is stationary and the magnet rotates. This is often used in things like a split-off or a Dixie. So how do magnetos work? Well, you all probably know the theory, and if you don't, you can jump on the internet and you'll find 1,000 sites which will tell you the basic information some of which will be right and some of which will be wrong. But the short version is, and I'm sure we just want the short version, the idea behind any magneto system is to generate an extremely high voltage at exactly the right time. This voltage causes a spark to jump across the spark plug gap, and that ignites the fuel and makes your engine run. And basically that's all you need to know about a magneto.
Three pixies come out.
For those of you who do want to see something a little bit more technical, there's a circuit from a Bosch ignition circuit from about 1911. And for those of you who want to think about something a little bit more technical, it's a wiring diagram for a dual ignition, which I don't particularly enjoy playing with, but I'm sure there are people who do know how to do that much better than me. So most of us are driving vehicles that are 70 to 100 years old, which means that they're running magnetos, which are 70 to 100 years old. And like us, old age and neglect has got to them. And they stop working for many reasons. One is that the primary wire is damaged or it's become detached from the capacitor. The second is that the secondary wire has become broken, and that's probably the most common reason why they fail. Or because in the old days that they were wound and then they were baked in a solution of shellac, the shellac over the years has become very, very soft, and so the coil becomes soft, letting the wires move, and so they stop working. Or the old-fashioned condenser, which was made of like a paper and a metal or aluminium, has failed. Sometimes it's as simple as the fact that the armature has become bent, and so therefore it's poling. Sometimes the magneto is just simply full of rust or wasp nests, and that'll stop them working fairly quickly. If you can't turn it over, that could possibly be your problem. Or the slip ring might be broken or burnt out. The pickups aren't working, which could be as simple as the spring's lost its tension, the carbon brush is worn out, or the slip ring or the pickup has developed a slight little crack, which will stop it from working. Sometimes it's as simple as the leads or your spark plugs are no longer functional. Any one of these things will probably mean that you need to send it in for a rebuild, or you will need to send it in for some parts to be replaced. One thing that it seldom is when your magneto stops is it's seldom the lack of magnetic pull. I will often have people who will come to me who have read on the internet that the magnetic pull or the magnetism is what makes a magneto work. And yes, you do need magnetism, but you don't need a great deal of it. And so sometimes someone will bring in a magneto that hasn't been looked at for 50 years, and they'll say, all you need to do is remagnetise it and it'll work again. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. If it was that simple, I wouldn't have 6 months' work ahead of me. One thing you can be sure of, though, is that if you start up your car or your motorbike and you head out for a drive and then you stop your car and then you can't start it again, it will be a crook magneto and it'll be a crook secondary winding in it, which you will then need to send to some expert to have rewound. looks like I'm running out of time, which is quite a relief for me. Most of you are quite capable mechanics. In fact, I'm sure that you all have much better mechanical skills than me, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. As I say, I've only been working in this field for 15 years, so I'm still a bit of a newcomer. And so, therefore, I recognise that many of the things that I'm going to tell you, or that I know, you already know. And I'm not here to tell you how to suck eggs, okay? You know what you're doing. But there are times when you do need an expert, and if you need an expert, if you need parts, if you just need a bit of advice, then I might be the person that you contact. Some of you will already have a magneto rebuilder that you're very happy with them. Stick with them. But if you haven't, then Blue Spark Magnetos is happy to offer you our services. But if your magneto stops when it's hot, you will definitely need an expert. If you've tried some of the tricks of getting it going on your own, such as cleaning your slip ring, cleaning and resetting your points, checking your own leads and your own pickups, if you've done all of those simple sort of jobs and you still can't get it to go, then you probably do need to send it to a magneto rebuilder. If you have things that you would rather be doing on a Sunday afternoon, like driving your other car or riding your other motorbike, then you probably should send your magneto to a magneto rebuilder. If you'd rather be doing anything outside rather than working in your shed, then you probably should send your magneto to a magneto rebuilder. And in the end, it is often cheaper to send your job out rather than getting on the internet and trying to buy the right parts to do it yourself. Thank you. Questions?
Round of applause for Gail.
Oh, what I have here is, this slide here shows you a picture of a slip ring and a pickup that have actually burnt out because a coil has been overwound and it has been firing through the winding rather than up where it's meant to, and you've ended up with that burning out like that. Sorry, questions?
Gentleman up the back.
Do you replace all your condensers with modern high-tech?
Absolutely. I actually have one client who refuses to let me replace condensers for him. And we have an argument every time I do a magneto for him. But I replace all of the condensers and capacitors with modern, high-quality replacements. I don't buy cheap ones. You can go and you can buy a very cheap capacitor or a condenser. I don't. I tend to spend a few more dollars because, again, in the long run, it works out to be cheaper to use good quality parts.
When you've got a 70-year-old magneto turn up, do you ever rebuild them without touching the armature? The windings?
I would suggest that would be fairly rare, but before I pull any armature apart, I do run a number of tests on it to check what its quality is. But I can't think of a case where I would have had an armature that's 70 years old that is still in good working condition. And really, the rewinding of the coil is the cheap part of the rebuild. So you'd be crazy if you didn't do it if it was that old. If it was a coil that had been rewound in the last 10 or 20 years, that would be an entirely different story.
Anyone else for Gail?
Can you reverse the direction of rotation?
Yes. Depending on what sort of magneto it is, it depends on what process you use. But with, say, something like, and I keep going back to your simple mag dyno because everybody knows what they are, With your simple Magdino, it's really just a matter of different points. On others, it's points, cam, slip ring, but yes, it's quite easy to do.
And last one was in the middle there.
A magneto that's being rebuilt, has it got a shelf life?
No. And maybe yes. Yes. Look, nothing is particularly straight. And when you talk about a shelf life, if you leave it there for 20 years, then things like the grease in your bearings will go hard. It's going to be hard to turn over. If you leave it sitting next to another magneto for 20 years, it may lose some of its magnetism, so it won't work as well. If you leave it sitting there for 20 years and it's in an environment that's damp, then it's going to rust up inside again and it's going to need some work. But if you're talking about, 12 months, 2 years, something like that, and you have it in a clean, dry environment, no, it shouldn't make any difference whatsoever. And if it does, it really is a very, very quick job for someone like me to get it working again.
I had a magneto fail on a car 35 years ago.
Right.
I took the magneto off and put my spare on.
Right.
Had that one rebuilt, put it in the back of the car, and that's still sitting in the back of the car waiting for the other one.
If it's dry and if it's in a nice dust-proof environment, it'll be just fine. But if it's not, bring it out, I'll clean your points and I'll remagnetise it for you and I'll make you coffee and offer you a chocolate biscuit at the same time.
Round of applause for Gail, please. I'm sure we've all learned something out of that. If not, where to go for coffee and a chocolate biscuit.
And that's exactly the same, except that it's been baked and varnished twice. Yeah. So it's,
I might have to come down for a cup of biscuit one day, eh?
yeah. Chocky biscuit.
That's right.